A white passenger refused to sit near my baby, and when he tried to push past my teen, the CEO's response left the whole cabin shocked. A white passenger refused to sit near my baby, thinking his arrogance would go unchallenged. Then he punched my teen for blocking the view, unaware that the father was already calculating the perfect response. The moment his fist flew, the cabin's power balance shifted. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses instantly when real authority rises. The man's voice pierced the quiet cabin. I'm not sitting next to a baby. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Bron Ketter's words, sharp and full of contempt, hung in the air like turbulence before a storm. He stood stiffly beside row 14, glaring down at the occupied seats as though he discovered a personal offense in their mere presence. Yarrick Rellin, seated in the middle seat, looked up, instinctively tightening his grip on the infant carrier nestled beside him. Inside, Tyron squirmed softly beneath a gray blanket, unaware of the tension blooming around him. Caden Rellin, seated by the window, slowly raised his eyes from a slim leather folio. His posture didn't change, but something behind his gaze sharpened, alert, measuring. Bron didn't budge. His carry-on dangled from one hand, his jaw clenched. Flight attendants, he called louder now, turning toward the front of the plane. There's a baby here, right next to my seat. You expect me to fly like this? The nearby rows shifted uncomfortably. A few passengers exchanged glances. Others quietly observed, not yet willing to get involved. The flight had barely begun boarding, but already the aisle felt narrower, the air heavier. Yarrick leaned slightly toward the armrest, trying to make himself smaller to give Bron room. I can move over a little, sir, if that helps, he offered politely, his voice soft but steady. Bron didn't even look at him. He dropped his bag with thud and folded his arms, still standing. That's not the point. Why should I have to adjust? I paid for peace, not noise. I want another seat. His tone wasn't impatient. It was entitled, the kind of tone that demanded compliance, not solutions. Caden finally spoke, calm and even. You're welcome to request a seat change, but until then, this is your assigned row. Bron shot him a glance, narrowed and unreadable. I shouldn't have to sit here at all, he muttered. Some passengers shouldn't fly. Before Caden could respond, a young male flight attendant approached. His name tag read Rollin Vesk, and his posture hinted at someone already juggling too many tasks. Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you get settled? No, you can help me not get settled. Bron snapped, gesturing broadly toward the row. I'm not sitting beside a crying baby and some twitchy teenager. This is what I paid for. Jarrick's ears reddened slightly, but he said nothing. Caden placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and gave the slightest shake of his head. Not now. Rollin offered a practiced smile. Sir, we'll see if any seats are available after boarding completes. For now, FAA rules require everyone to be seated so we can prepare for departure. Bron's lips curled. You're not taking this seriously. I assure you I am, Rollin replied. But we need to keep the boarding process moving. Please take your seat. Reluctantly, Bron moved. He dropped into the aisle seat with exaggerated slowness, pushing back slightly more than necessary, causing Jarrick's shoulder to bump awkwardly against the infant carrier. Yarrick held still. Tyron let out a tiny sigh and shifted. The baby wasn't crying, wasn't even fussing, but Bron stared at him like he was a ticking bomb. Rollin gave Caden an apologetic look before stepping away to deal with another row. Bron sat stiffly, his knees angled away, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Every few seconds, he would glance sideways, eyes flicking between Caden's folded hands and Jarrick's quiet attentiveness to the baby. Caden remained silent, his mind calculating. Bron wasn't just irritated. He was staking territory. The man wasn't offended by the baby's presence. He was offended that his demands had not been immediately met. Yarrick whispered, Should I? No. Caden replied quietly, not unkindly. You're doing everything right. Bron chuckled under his breath. Right? He's already blocking the view of the aisle. Can't even see the cart when it comes. Caden turned just slightly. That's not a requirement. It's my comfort, Bron replied smugly. And I won't tolerate blocked views. A passenger across the aisle cleared his throat, but said nothing. The silence returned, heavier now, broken only by the occasional shuffle of boarding feet and the overhead chimes signaling cabin announcements. Yarrick adjusted Tyron's blanket. The motion was gentle, practiced. He'd done this 100 times before. But now every move felt like it was being watched through crosshairs. Bronn shifted again. "I'm warning you," he muttered low enough for only Caden to hear. "If he blocks my view again, we're going to have a problem." Caden didn't flinch. His voice was smooth as glass. "The only problem here is how you've decided to behave." Bronn scoffed but said nothing more. The final passengers began trickling in. Rollin returned, confirming the overheads were secure. Caden leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving the man beside him. Yarrick stayed still, one hand resting lightly on Tyron's carrier. The baby slept on. Bronn flexed his fingers. "Some passengers shouldn't fly at all," he muttered. And with that, the first crack in the story's unfolding conflict was pressed. Bronn stepped closer before anyone could react, his shadow falling over Yarrick as though he were claiming the entire row. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to stare yet unable to look away. The aisle lights flickered slightly as the cabin crew prepared for departure, casting thin bands of blue across Bronn's face and sharpening the tension etched into his expression. Caden noticed a change immediately. Bronn's breathing had deepened, and his jaw tightened with a kind of restless impatience. The conflict was no longer subtle. It was beginning its climb. Trying to diminish the growing friction, Caden gently slid Tyron's carrier closer to the window. His movements were slow and careful. Every action meant to signal peace rather than challenge. But Bronn's eyes narrowed, as if offended by the attempt. Yarrick, sensing the hostility, quietly said, "I can switch with you, sir. Maybe that will help." His voice was steady but cautious. Bronn didn't even look at him. "No," Bronn replied sharply, his tone flat and dismissive. "I picked this seat for a reason." The emphasis made several passengers glance his way again. His refusal wasn't about comfort, it was about control, and he tightened his grip on the overhead bin handle as if asserting ownership of the space itself. A moment later, Rollin Vest returned, trying to restore calm with a professional smile. "Sir, please take your seat while we sort this out," he said gently. But Bronn lifted a hand toward Yarrick instead, pointing with a slow, accusing motion. "Children ruin flights," Bronn said, his voice loud enough to carry several rows. "Look at him. He's already causing problems." Whispers rippled across the cabin. Some passengers frowned. Others exchanged looks of concern. Yet no one stepped in. Dramatic irony hung thickly in the air. Yarrick, who had barely spoken a word, was the least disruptive person on board, while Bronn stirred tension with every breath. Rollin attempted diplomacy again. "Sir, please sit until we can adjust the seating chart." But Bronn stepped forward instead, closing the distance between himself and the teen. His height cast Yarrick in shadow. A cold smirk curved across Bronn's face, one that suggested not irritation but intent. "If you block my view again," Bronn murmured, voice low and threatening, "you will regret it." Yarrick's eyes widened slightly, not with fear, but with disbelief. Still, he lowered his gaze and focused on soothing Tyron, lifting the baby's blanket with gentle hands. The infant's soft cooing filled the small space between them. What should have been a calming moment instead triggered something darker in Bronn, who interpreted the gesture as defiance. Caden inhaled slowly, the controlled breath of a man calculating possibilities. Reacting too soon would escalate things. Reacting too late would endanger Yarrick and the baby. His thoughts shifted like a strategist arranging pieces on a board. He knew patience was his strongest weapon, though it tested his every nerve. With a deliberate movement filled with arrogance, Bronn plopped into a seat. His shoulder struck Yarrick's arm, not accidentally, but with intentional weight. Yarrick flinched lightly, not from pain, but from the clear message behind the shove. Rollin's expression tightened as he watched. "Everyone remained calm," the flight attendant said, though his voice carried more worry than authority. He took a step back, scanning the area as if bracing for what might come next. "We'll resolve seating shortly." Then he walked away, shoulders tense. Silence settled over the row for only a heartbeat before Braun leaned just slightly toward Yarrick, his stare intense and unblinking. Caden could feel the shift in temperature around them, the way the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Yarrick sat upright, eyes fixed forward, determined not to show how shaken he truly felt. Braun's glare deepened, his expression twisted with an unspoken challenge. The imbalance of power, an adult towering over a teen trying to protect a baby, made the scene feel already on the edge of breaking. Dramatic irony hovered again. Braun believed his behavior went unchecked, unaware that Caden's wrist-mounted recorder had captured everything from a moment he first complained. A turbulence warning chimed softly overhead, though the true disturbance was the man seated beside them. Caden's focus sharpened. The storm, quiet but deadly, was forming its shape, and every instinct within him sensed they had crossed the threshold where words alone would no longer keep peace. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as preparations continued, but even the softened glow could not hide Braun's expression. His eyes remained locked on Yarrick with an unsettling intensity. It was not a look of mere annoyance. It was the early edge of something dangerous, something building. And as the hum of the engines grew and the passengers settled into uneasy stillness, one truth became unmistakable. The fracture in the cabin's peace had already begun widening, and Braun seemed determined to push it to its edge. The part ends as Braun stares at Yarrick with an intensity that feels like a storm waiting to break. Braun's fist slammed down on the armrest with a loud thud that sliced through the murmur of safety instructions like a blade through silk. Several passengers jumped. One elderly man in 3B glanced up with concern, but quickly looked away. Braun's knuckles whitened, jaw set as though the plane's slight delay had been a personal betrayal. Yarrick didn't move at first. He was still holding the side of Tyron's baby carrier, gently rocking it as the infant let out a soft coo. But even that sound, innocent brief, seemed to land like static in Braun's ears. "Can you not?" Braun muttered through clenched teeth, his eyes locked on Yarrick. Yarrick looked over, startled but respectful. "He's almost asleep, sir." Braun snorted. "Sir, what are you, a scout troop?" Caden shifted slightly in his seat, eyes never leaving Braun. "Yarrick," he said softly, voice low and steady, "just keep your focus. Breathing. In and out." The words weren't just for Yarrick. They were a quiet warning, a signal between father and son. Braun leaned forward suddenly, as if offended by the sound of calm itself. Telling your kid to breathe like that? That's the problem. Weak lessons. Weak results. Yarrick tensed but said nothing. He lowered his head and gently lifted the carrier's blanket to check on Tyron's breathing. Just a soft motion, barely a lean, but Braun stiffened. "You're blocking my view again," he snapped. "What view?" Yarrick asked, genuinely confused. "My aisle," Braun growled, gesturing to the narrow corridor beside them. "I paid for unrestricted visibility. You're interfering." The logic was absurd. There was nothing to see but knees, armrests, and a closed curtain beyond the first-class divide. But Braun's claim wasn't about space. It was about control. Caden looked at Braun now, fully, not aggressively, just enough to say he was watching, judging, measuring. "Mr. Ketter," Caden said calmly, "there is no policy guaranteeing aisle views. My son is trying to keep the baby settled." Braun turned his head slowly, the veins along his temple twitching. "Don't speak for him," he hissed. "He's old enough to know better." Passengers began to notice. One man across the aisle lowered his headphones. A woman diagonally behind them stopped flipping through her magazine. There was a slow ripple of awareness, like the air pressure before a storm. Foreshadowing hovered in the way Tyron started to stir again. The infant gave a soft whimper, sensing the tension to the fabric of the cabin more keenly than anyone. Braun's eyes flicked toward the baby, with open disdain. "You really thought it was a good idea to bring that thing on a plane?" he muttered, loud enough for the row behind to hear. Caden's eyes narrowed. Still seated, still, but less patient now. "You're speaking about a child. I suggest you choose your words with more care." But Braun wasn't listening. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be holding briefly at taxiway Delta 4 due to weather alignment clearance. We should be airborne in approximately 10 minutes. Thank you for your patience." Braun's patience was non-existent. Of course, he barked. Of course there's a delay. And I'm stuck next to this sideshow. Then came the armrest. Another loud slam. Yarrick flinched, even though he wasn't the target. Caden raised a hand, palm down, a silent message. Stay calm. Yarrick nodded, barely. Then, trying to defuse a moment, he shifted slightly in his seat, leaning just an inch away from Braun's line of sight. There. Better? He asked gently. Braun's lip curled. Oh, now you're mocking me? No, Yarrick replied, keeping his voice steady. Just trying to help. But that word, help, landed like an insult to Braun's pride. His breathing grew shallower, chest rising and falling with manufactured offense. A slight jolt of turbulence caused the plane to shiver. Yarrick instinctively reached forward to secure Tyron's carrier. His hand brushed the top edge of the seat back in front of him. Braun surged. He did it again, he barked. Leaned right into my space on purpose. Caden unbuckled his seatbelt in one smooth motion and sat upright. That's enough, he said sharply. You will not raise your voice near this child again. A hush fell around the immediate rows. Rollin, the flight attendant, was nowhere in sight. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Braun leaned in, his voice now a whisper drenched in threat. You think you're safe because people are watching. The cabin lights dim for takeoff, and Braun seized a moment like a spark searching for fuel. The darkness had barely settled when he leaned sharply into Yarrick, his shoulder jutting forward with calculated force. You're blocking the view again, he hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. Yarrick froze mid-motion. Tyron's bottle still halfway out of the bag. Nothing was in Braun's line of sight. There was no view to block, but the accusation hung in the air like smoke. I'm sorry, Yarrick said softly, his voice steady but thin. He offered the apology only to prevent trouble, not because he believed he had done anything wrong. Braun straightened with an air of triumph, as if he had successfully won a contest no one else was playing. His eyes glinted in the dim cabin, feeding on the control he thought he had seized. As the engines roared and the plane sped down the runway, the cabin vibrated with a soft, rolling intensity. When the wheels lifted off the ground, the aircraft gave a gentle shake. Nothing unusual, just the body adjusting to flight. Yarrick instinctively reached a hand toward the seat back to steady himself, careful not to disturb Tyron, whose tiny breast puffed beneath his blanket. Braun reacted as if struck. He lurched upward in his seat, half standing, his shadow cutting across Yarrick. He touched me on purpose, he shouted, pointing a rigid finger directly at the boy. His voice burst through the cabin like a sudden alarm. Rollin Vest hurried down the aisle, his steps quick and tight. Sir, please sit down, he urged, palms raised in an attempt to steady the situation. The seatbelt sign is on. Let's keep calm until... But Braun had already crossed a hidden boundary within himself, a line no one else could see. His breath came fast, his jaw tightened, and the dim light his expression twisted into something sharper. Before Rollin could finish his sentence, Braun swung his arm. The punch landed across Yarrick's cheek with a sickening thud. Gas erupted throughout the cabin, as if a wave had swept through the rows. Yarrick staggered sideways, gripping the armrest as pain shot across his face. Tyron burst into frightened cries, his small body trembling from the shock of the sudden noise and motion. For a moment, the world felt suspended. The hum of the engines, the murmurs of the passengers, the flicker of overhead lights all fading behind the sound of that single blow. Caden rose immediately, but not with anger. His movements were controlled, precise, almost frightening in their calm. He stepped in front of Yarrick, positioning his body like a gate closing against a storm. His eyes locked onto Braun with the steadiness of a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. Braun, however, mistook Caden's silence for hesitation. He lunged at me. Braun barked, clutching his own shoulder as if wounded. You all saw it. He came at me first. His voice strained with forced injury, but the passengers around him exchanged looks of disbelief. Rollin's face blanched. Sir, that is not what happened, he said, though his voice wavered, torn between training and the chaos unfolding. Caden lifted his wrist with calm certainty. The entire incident is recorded, he said, his tone level and quiet, but carry enough weight to shift the air itself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In that moment, the dramatic irony ripened. Bronn believed he had asserted dominance. Unaware, he had stepped into a plan he never knew existed. Phones appeared in hands all across the row, their screens glowing as passengers captured the scene. A few whispered their shock. Others muttered their disbelief. Tyron's cries softened as Yarrick gently soothed him, despite the sting still burning across his cheek. Rollin called toward the front for backup, his voice tight with urgency. "We need assistance here now." Bronn's expression flickered, just for a second, betraying a crack of realization. His eyes darted to Caden's wrist of ice, then to the passengers filming him, then back to Caden again. Something shifted in his posture, as though he had just recognized the gravity of the moment or the mistake he had made. Caden didn't step forward, didn't raise a hand, didn't threaten. He simply stood there, still as stone, guarding his son and nephew with an authority that didn't need volume. Behind him, Yarrick held Tyron close, his breathing steadier now, though pain lingered in the set of his jaw. The cabin seemed to quiet all at once, the tension coiling into a single breathless pause as Bronn stared at the man standing between him and the boy he had struck. The illusion of power Bronn had clung to began to crumble as the truth surrounded him, from witnesses, from recordings, from the calm force standing inches away. The moment froze as Bronn realizes he may have struck the wrong family. Bronn stood over Yarrick with his fist still half raised, his chest heaving like a man who had proven something to himself. The cabin was locked in a stunned, breathless silence. Jarrick's hand pressed against the stinging side of his face, but he remained seated, his posture rigid with dignity, refusing to rise or retaliate. His composure only deepened the contrast between the aggressor and the boy he had struck. Every passenger nearby seemed frozen between shock and disbelief, their eyes flicking from Bronn's clenched jaw to Jarrick's trembling fingers. Caden did not hesitate. He rose with controlled precision that made the air around him shift. Without a single wasted motion, he lifted his wrist and tapped the corner of his watch. A crisp tone echoed faintly. "This is a formal report of in-flight assault," he announced, his voice steady enough to cut through the tension. His calmness unsettled Bronn more than anger ever could. Rollin, the lead flight attendant, hurried down the aisle, his expression drawn tight with confusion and fear. "Everyone needs to stay seated," he urged, though the quiver in his voice betrayed uncertainty. His eyes darted between Jarrick's reddened cheek and Bronn's surging defensiveness, as though he couldn't decide where the truth leaned. Bronn's reaction was immediate. He stumbled backward into his seat, clutching his shoulder as if wounded. "He attacked me first," he shouted, pointing at Yarrick with a shaking finger. "That kid lunged at me. You all saw it." He scanned the aisle desperately, seeking validation, but dramatic irony had already begun to unravel him. Every witness knew what really happened. A subtle rustling broke the hush. 2 rows back, a retired school principal named Murrin stood halfway from his seat, gripping the headrest for balance. His voice, though aged, carried the firmness of decades spent commanding classrooms. "I saw it all," he said as every head turned toward him. "That boy did nothing wrong." Bronn's face twitched, a crack forming in the mask he had worn so confidently moments earlier. Rollins swallowed hard. We'll sort everything out after landing," he said, stepping backward as though retreating from the pressure of choosing sides. His attempt at neutrality only deepened the tension. Several passengers exchanged disbelieving glances. Caden's eyes followed Rollin, sharp and unyielding. "No," he said softly, yet with enough authority to halt the attendant mid-step. "He needs to be separated now. My son is not sitting beside the man who hit him." Rollin hesitated, torn between protocol and the reality unfolding before him. Bronn glared from his seat, breathing heavily. His eyes were wild, restless. Something darker simmered beneath the surface, a brewing warning of what he thought he could still control. Foreshadowing crept into the moment as Bronn leaned forward and hissed, "You'll regret trying to ruin me." The words were low but venomous, slicing the air between them. A few passengers gasped. Yarrick stiffened, instinctively angling Tyron's carrier farther from the aisle. Caden did not flinch. He stepped 1 inch closer, his voice clear but cold. "I won't need to ruin you," he replied. You already did it to yourself. The aisle fell quiet again, but the silence this time was charged, an unspoken acknowledgement that a shift had occurred. Something irreversible. Rollin exhaled shakily and backed away. I'll inform the captain, he said, turning toward the front of the cabin. As he disappeared behind a curtain, another attendant slid subtly closer to Caden. The man's movements were discreet, almost guilty. In a swift practice gesture, he slipped a small contact card into Caden's palm, without breaking eye contact. He's caused issues before, he whispered, his jaw tightening with unspoken frustration. Just be careful. The confession deepened the dramatic irony. Braun's history was no mystery to the crew, yet every complaint had been tucked away under the carpet of convenience. Meanwhile, Jarrett's composure wavered slightly as he leaned closer to Caden. His cheek was still red, swelling slowly. Dad, he murmured, voice soft but steady. I don't want revenge. I just want to protect Tyron. Caden looked at him, pride flickering beneath the calm facade. Jarrett's strength was not loud or forceful. It was quiet, enduring, and more powerful than Braun's display could ever be. Tyron whimpered softly in his carrier, sensing the unease in the air, and Yarrick gently rocked him with a practiced touch that soothed the child instantly. Around them, passengers whispered among themselves, some in outrage, others in disbelief. A few recorded statements into their phones, preparing their own accounts. The environment hummed with a rising collective awareness. This was no longer a simple argument over space. It was a moment that revealed character, truth, and the weight of silence. As Caden returned to his seat, his eyes remained locked on Braun. The man sat hunched forward, hands clasped, his earlier confidence crumbling into something more desperate. He glanced up occasionally, only to find Caden's unwavering stare waiting for him. A reminder that this time, his version of events would not be the one that survived. The scene settled like a storm preparing its second wave. The passengers waited. Yarrick steadied his breathing. Caden reviewed the recording silently in his mind, ready to present at the moment the cabin crew returned. And Braun, still seething with misplaced defiance, repeated words he would soon regret even more deeply. You'll regret trying to ruin me. Caden's reply echoed like a final verdict. I won't need to ruin you. You already did it to yourself. The turbulence jolted the aircraft, a sudden drop that caused overhead bins to rattle and a few startled gasps to rise from the cabin. Braun Ketter's eyes twitched. He had been watching Caden roll in for the past 20 minutes, more specifically, watching the man do nothing. No outburst, no challenge, just quiet precision, and it unnerved him. Caden remained composed as the plane stabilized, his fingers tapping a sleek wrist-mounted device. A soft chime confirmed that the audio recording of Braun's earlier outburst had been securely copied and sent to 3 nearby passengers via Airlink. Each transmission was marked by a faint pulse of blue light, barely noticeable, but deliberate. He didn't glance at Braun. He didn't need to. Braun shifted in his seat, his confidence fraying like an old thread. He glanced across the aisle and saw a man in a dark business coat, nodding down at his device. Another chime. Another backup. Caden was building something, quietly, methodically, and Braun could feel it tightening around him like a net. Pain is temporary. Truth isn't, Caden said aloud, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone seated nearby. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, but the message landed. Even Rollin Vesk, the lead flight attendant, paused as he passed by, his expression unreadable. Braun scowled. You think recordings make you right? He muttered, then tried to unlock his phone with shaky fingers. He thumbed through his contacts, stopping on one labeled only W's, but as he hit dial, the connection screen blinked red. No service. Just altitude. Just silence. Across the row, Yarrick checked on Tyron, the infant's soft breath steady under a blanket. The teen's cheek was still swollen from Braun's earlier strike, but his movements were careful, protective. He tucked the edges of Tyron's cap around the baby's head and looked toward his father. Caden met his gaze briefly and gave a single nod, nothing theatrical, just reassurance. Murren, the retired school principal seated 2 rows behind, leaned forward slightly. Need me to start the statement? He asked in a low voice. Please. Caden replied, offering him a wireless stylus already connected to a notepad tab. The older man began typing, his brow tight with focus. Then, a rustle of movement from the front. A new figure appeared, tall, silver-haired, and confident in posture. A passenger from first class. He held out a device toward Caden. I caught some of it from up front. He was talking loud enough for the next cabin to hear. Called your son and nephew. Dirty kids ruining the view. Thought you want the clip. Caden took the device with a nod of gratitude. What's your name? Dr. Ella Vaughn. I'm a neurology consultant out of Carvin Ridge. Thank you, Dr. Vaughn. Caden plugged the clip into his incident file, tagging it by time and cabin location. Now we're building a chain of truth. Braun stood abruptly, eyes flashing. What chain? You're making this worse for yourself. He took a step forward, wobbling slightly from another small pocket of turbulence. Caden remained seated, calm, silent. Braun lunged toward Caden's arm, reaching for phone in his lap, but he never made contact. Yarrick stepped in, not violently, but with unwavering firmness. He moved in front of his father's seat and stood tall, arms low and open, shoulders squared. His presence alone was enough to stop Braun's momentum. The tension in the cabin soared. You need to back up, Rollins said sharply, emerging from the galley with two other crew members flanking him. His tone no longer held neutrality. It was command. Braun blinked, breathing heavily, suddenly aware that all eyes were on him. His moment of authority had slipped through his fingers. Yarrick didn't flinch. He simply remained between Braun and Caden, unmoving. His voice was soft but steady as he said, You're not getting past me. Braun didn't respond. Couldn't, as the air grew heavier with the knowledge that nothing was going to be forgotten, as phones continued recording and witnesses quietly documented everything. Caden leaned back ever so slightly and whispered to his son. His hands stay open, his body blocks only with presence. Braun Ketter charged forward with heavy steps, the muscles in his face twitching with suppressed fury as he stormed down the narrow aisle toward the front galley. His eyes burned with misplaced righteousness, scanning the cabin crew for an ally he hadn't yet found. Flight attendants looked up, alert but unmoved, their posture straightening with cautious professionalism. The buzz of the plane's systems was the only sound above the low murmur of passengers, who now followed his movements with wary glances. Braun was no longer part of the cabin's rhythm. He was a disturbance echoing through it. Near the rear seats, Yarrick adjusted Tyron's cap with slow, steady hands. The baby, still recovering from the earlier chaos, blinked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. In that quiet act of care, there was a contrast so sharp it could split steel. While Braun saw control through aggression, Yarrick reclaimed it through calm. Caden, observing both scenes at once, quietly opened a secure sync interface and tapped out a message to his legal advisor, Duran Mall. His thumb hovered for a second before hitting send. Attached were synchronized files, audio recordings, flight logs, and 2 passenger testimonies. The moment they transmitted, something shifted in him. The fight wasn't future tense anymore. It had already begun. Braun, unaware of the transmission or its implications, continued prowling near the galley like a wolf pacing the edge of a campfire. He leaned toward one crew member, his voice hushed but intense. This whole thing is being twisted. The kid leaned into me. I reacted. I have every right to protect myself. The crewman nodded politely, but said nothing. His eyes, however, flicked briefly toward Roland Vesk, the lead attendant, who stood near the service cart with arms folded tightly across his chest. The silence, thick and deliberate, offered Braun no ground. He turned and barked. Are you just going to stand there? Before anyone could respond, a calm but clear voice rose from midway down the aisle. Braun, everything that happens now is yours to own. Caden didn't stand. He didn't need to. His tone cut through the air like steel through fog. Braun turned, shoulders tense, nostrils flaring. The passengers between them shrank slightly in their seats, suddenly aware that something irreversible had been set in motion. Dr. Ella Vaughn, the composed first-class passenger who had earlier provided Caden with supplemental footage, stepped into view from the forward section. His posture was unshaken, his eyes steady. I know who you are, he said plainly. We were at Vorn Gate Terminal last year. You tried to get a junior staff member fired because your drink wasn't cold enough. Braun froze, momentarily caught between denial and outrage. The past he thought buried was resurfacing with surgical precision. You don't know anything, he snapped, voice rising. I know enough, Ella replied. And now everyone else will too. In an instant, Braun lunged forward, jaw clenched, arm raised, not to strike, but to intimidate. It didn't matter. Rollin stepped between them like a closing vault, hand raised flat toward Braun's chest. You need to sit down before we restrain you. Braun stopped mid-motion, as if he'd suddenly realized just how alone he was. His eyes darted around the cabin again, but this time they found no refuge, no sympathetic expressions, no passengers pretending not to notice. Every face he met was stone, and every camera lens a silent witness. Yarrick, still seated beside the baby carrier, watched with quiet vigilance. His expression betrayed no fear, only readiness, an unspoken promise that if Braun so much as shifted toward them again, the response would come not with violence, but with dignity Braun couldn't understand. Kaidan leaned back slightly in his seat, his hand resting on the armrest, fingers steady. He had mapped out every possibility hours ago. Now, each move played out like lines in a script already written. Then came the twist that Braun hadn't planned for. The overhead chime sounded, followed by the calm, unmistakable voice of Captain Harvin Dross over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Please remain seated for the remainder of the flight. Upon arrival, airport security will be meeting us at the gate to assist with a passenger-related protocol. Thank you for your cooperation. A hush fell over the cabin. No turbulence had ever landed so heavy. Braun's shoulders slumped. The tone of the captain's voice, formal, deliberate, final, struck harder than any punch. His hands twitched at his sides. Whatever plan, he thought, he had evaporated in the pressurized silence of that announcement. He turned toward Kaidan, as if to speak, to argue, to plead, but found no opening. Kaidan met his gaze without malice. Braun, he repeated softly, everything that happens now is yours to own. Braun lunged to the overhead, but in the instant the cabin lights blinked into descent mode. The metallic clatter of zippers and buckles echoed through the plane as he rifled through his carry-on with wild hands, muttering sharp phrases under his breath. His shoulders jerked with every movement, eyes darting back toward the cockpit as if something or someone was coming for him. A pen rolled down the aisle. A passenger in row 9 flinched. No one spoke. From his seat, Yarrick tightened the baby carrier straps and shifted slightly, so his body formed a gentle barrier between Braun and his infant cousin. Tyron stirred but didn't cry, comforted by Jarrick's steady presence. Kaidan stood slowly, not with alarm, but with intent, and stepped forward into the aisle just enough to be seen by the crew. He reached into the side pocket of his coat, retrieved a compact silver drive, and held out to Rollin Vesk, the lead flight attendant. Time-stamped evidence, Kaidan said, his voice calm and clear. Full sync, start to finish. Rollin hesitated for only a moment before taking the drive. He glanced at the label printed on its casing. Incident Archive, FLT 718 Relin. Then he nodded and disappeared down the front corridor toward the cockpit. Braun didn't notice. He was too busy pulling out a second bag, one he hadn't touched the entire flight, and unzipping it halfway, fingers trembling. His mouth moved silently as he scanned the contents. Notebooks, a tablet, a small box. He shoved them all aside and whispered, "Not here, not now, not like this." His hands clenched into fists. Then the wheels hit the runway. A heavy thud, a bounce, the forward tilt of momentum, and Braun bolted. Without warning, he launched down the aisle toward the front galley, dragged his bag behind him with a sweeping arc that struck a passenger's knee. Gasps broke across the cabin. Someone yelled, "Hey!" A man near the emergency row stood instinctively, only to freeze when Captain Harvin Dross appeared in the doorway. The captain's frame was tall and deliberate. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. With one hand raised, he issued a command loud enough to reach the rear of the plane. Security alert has been triggered. All passengers remain seated. Officers will board momentarily. Braun stopped mid-stride, 1 foot half over the galley line, his shoulders heaving with disbelief. For the first time, the rhythm of the cabin worked against him. The lights, the locked cockpit door, the drawn curtains, the rising awareness in every eye, none had obeyed him. He turned sharply, flinging his hand toward Yarrick. "It was him," he shouted. "That kid came at me. He started it." The claim hung in the air like smoke, but it didn't spread. It dissipated, because 3 passengers stood in unison. Murrin, the retired principal from row 11, stepped into the aisle. His cane tapped softly against the floor. "That's false," he said, his voice weathered but unwavering. Dr. Ella Vaughn followed from first class, arms folded across his chest. "I have footage," he said simply. And behind them, a younger man in a business suit lifted his phone. "I caught audio from the moment," he yelled. None of what he's saying matches. Braun's mouth opened, then closed. For once, he had no language to bend the moment to his will. His shoulders dropped half an inch, not in defeat, but in confusion, like a man who couldn't understand why the curtain didn't fall when he expected applause. Yarrick remained seated, his hands resting on the edge of the baby carrier. He didn't speak. He didn't move. And in his stillness, the cabin found its judgment, one of presence, not retaliation, of quiet defense, not spectacle. 2 uniformed officers boarded seconds later, flanking Captain Dross. Their eyes swept the rows, pausing on Caden, then Yarrick, then Braun. The passenger accused of unprovoked assault. "Please step forward." One officer said firmly. Braun hesitated, then finally dropped his bag. One last look around the cabin betrayed his hope for an ally. None came. Even Rollin, now back in the cockpit, remained still at the galley wall, eyes downcast. The officers cuffed Braun without resistance. Caden returned to his seat, crouched beside the baby, and gently drew a soft blanket over Tyron's legs. He checked Jarrick's expression, steady, watchful, composed, and then exhaled a breath he had held since the wheels touched the ground. Passengers whispered. Some recorded. Others sat in stunned silence. And as Braun was led down the narrow aisle, past every face he tried to intimidate, every voice he tried to silence, every witness who saw too clearly to forget, Caden spoke only once. His voice was low, almost too soft to catch. Justice doesn't shout, it lands. The passenger smirked, confident no one would confront him, unaware that every movement, every witness, and every second had already been anticipated by a father who doesn't tolerate threats to his family. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when preparation meets precision, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The metal door to the private holding area slid shut with a mechanical hum behind them. No greetings, no delays, just 4 metal chairs, a long table, and the quiet tension of truth waiting to be heard. Caden Rellin stepped forward without hesitation, his posture composed, every movement purposeful. Yarrick sat beside him, his left cheek bruised, the mark sharp beneath the fluorescent lights. Rollin Vesk, the shaken but dutiful flight attendant, took the seat across from them. On his left, Murrin, the retired school principal, sat upright, a man used to speaking up when others hesitated. Dr. Ella Vaughn stood at the side momentarily before settling near the end, his briefcase open and organized with surgical precision. A uniformed officer with stern brow placed the evidence pouch on the table, then nodded to Caden. "Whenever you're ready." Caden didn't clear his throat or ask for water. He simply began. At approximately 18 minutes after initial taxi, my 15-year-old son, Yarrick, was struck without provocation by a passenger named Braun Ketter. We have full audio and partial video, synchronized from multiple sources. He handed over a compact drive, labeled in his steady handwriting. Incident: Flight 718, witness corroboration. The officer inserted the drive into the console. As footage loaded, another team member checked timestamps against Caden's spoken account. Yarrick remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor until one of the clips played the moment Braun raised his voice about the view being blocked. The same phrase repeated across 2 separate recordings, one from Caden's wrist, the other from Ella's tablet. It echoed in the sterile room, like a wound refusing to close. Then came the turning point, Braun's punch. Yerrick flinched again as the moment replayed, but he did not look away. The officer reviewing the footage glanced at his partner. "This matches every passenger report," he said lowly, "and the timestamps align. There's no manipulation." Rollins swallowed hard. "I need to say something." All eyes turned to him. His hands trembled slightly as he interlaced them. "This wasn't Braun's first incident. I've filed complaints before. 3 times in the last year. They were logged. I don't know why they didn't go anywhere, but I sent them to the proper channel." Silence. Not disbelief, recognition. The kind that forms when a buried pattern finally surfaces. Caden's voice remained level, and yet he kept flying, with no consequence, no warnings, no review. At that moment, the door opened. A man in a dark blazer stepped in. His badge read, M. Drellin, Legal Liaison, Skylar Air. He greeted no one. He merely sat and spoke with cool detachment. "Gentlemen," he began, "the airline takes passenger conflict seriously. That said, perhaps we can avoid extended complications by settling this quietly." Caden interrupted, his eyes sharp. Drellin nodded once, as if offering a favor. "Discretion benefits all parties. Visibility benefits the right ones," Caden replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Yerrick, voice low but firm, finally spoke. "If we don't make it visible, it'll happen again. Maybe to someone without a camera. Or without a parent who can help." The officer beside Drellin scribbled something on his notepad. Drellin leaned back, his expression unreadable. But the mood had changed. The room no longer revolved around his offer. It revolved around what had already happened. Dr. Ella Vaughn leaned forward. "If this escalates to a public or legal forum, I'll testify on their behalf. I witnessed the entire confrontation from first class. I've also interacted with Braun before. He's known for causing friction." Murrin nodded. "Same here. I'll give a written statement. And if it helps more than just Yerrick, I'll read it aloud wherever you need." Caden looked at each man, his voice now carrying the weight of unspoken resolve. "We're not asking for favors. We're demanding truth." For a brief moment, there was no movement, just a quiet echo of those words lingering like smoke in the air. Then, beyond the glass partition, another man appeared, a marketing badge visible on his lapel, the airline's PR liaison. He was reviewing a tablet, watching the synced footage, his jaw clenched, his shoulders sank. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Yerrick watched him go and whispered to his father, "That guy knows." Caden didn't respond immediately. He stared at the closed door where the man had vanished, then turned back to the others. His tone shifted, not just calm now, but anchored. "The next step isn't a press conference. It's not a lawsuit," he said. "It's a review of what systems failed and who allowed them to." He stood, signaling the end of the statement. Yerrick stood beside him. The bruise was still fresh, but his gaze was clear. As they waited for the officers to prepare the final report, he leaned closer and said, "He thought we were weak because we didn't fight, but I think this is stronger." The video was only 38 seconds long. A shaky live stream clip, captured from row 14, showed the exact moment Braun Ketter's fist struck Yerrick Rellin's face. The camera wobbled slightly, gasps echoing to the cabin, and then still just enough to catch the haunting silence that followed. Jarrick's unmoving frame, Tyron's startled cry, and Caden's quiet but firm voice cutting through the air. Within hours of landing, that footage had spread across 3 travel forums, then migrated to a national discussion board moderated by a consumer watchdog group. By morning, it was featured on the homepage of AeroWatch, a regulatory platform known for tracking passenger incidents. Most users didn't know the people involved, but they saw what mattered: a grown man striking a teenager on a plane. In a quiet airport hotel suite just outside Voltron, Caden sat at a modest desk while Yerrick rested on a couch nearby, an ice pack gently pressed against his cheek. Tyron slept soundly in a travel crib by the window. The room buzzed softly with muted alerts, emails, messages, and notifications flooding in like a rising tide. Caden didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, reading the words that had just been sent to him. "Recognize the guy in your video. Name's Braun Ketter. worked at Dowson Aero. Had 2 outbursts we all knew about, but his cousin was regional supervisor. He got away with it. Hope this helps. Anonymous. Caden's jaw tightened, not with surprise, but with confirmation. His instincts had been right. Braun's behavior wasn't isolated. It was institutionalized, protected, recycled. He clicked Archive on the message and opened a secure file folder titled Incident Chain. Inside were layered documents, flight logs, synced video from his wrist recorder, Ella's phone cam, and Jarek seat view. Together, they formed a near-seamless 360-degree reconstruction of the event. A knock sounded. Yarrick stirred, blinking drowsily. Caden stood and moved the door, opening it to find a hotel courier holding a sealed envelope and tablet. "This just arrived for you, sir. From a Mr. Kellen from the Voltron Post." Caden accepted the items without a word, thanked the courier, and closed the door. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a media request from a senior reporter asking for an interview, ideally before the story breaks nationally. Caden read the final line of the message aloud. "Your side deserves to be heard before the world forms its own version." He folded the paper once and placed it in the drawer beside him. He would not give the story to the headlines. Not yet. Not until the truth had finished landing. Back in his chair, Caden tapped a few keys and encrypted the latest footage. Then, with calm precision, he began writing an email addressed to Murren Voss and Dr. Ella Vaughn. The subject line was simple: Joint Statement, Passenger Protocol Reform. Meanwhile, across the city, Braun Kidder was pacing in a dimly lit office outside his bail attorney's chambers, his face bruised not from conflict, but from embarrassment. He barked into phone, demanding an emergency lawsuit for public defamation and psychological damage. He referenced unauthorized recordings, called the father a manipulator, and insisted that people don't know the full story. They soon would, but not the one Braun wanted. In court, the countersuit was filed under emergency civil review. Braun's legal team arrived confident, armed with terms like emotional duress and digital privacy invasion. But the courtroom projector told a different tale. 3 videos merged, time-stamped, enhanced, played in front of the judge, jury, and staff. First, Caden's wrist view, Braun hovering menacingly. Then Ella's side angle, capturing the punch. Finally, Jarek's own frame, still recording even after impact. The judge looked over her glasses at Braun. "You claim defamation, but this footage contains no fabrication. It is exact. It is uncut." Braun's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Mr. Ketter, the motion to proceed with your claim is denied. This court will instead schedule a preliminary hearing to investigate the airline's previous inaction on known behavioral risks." Caden, seated beside his son at the rear of the courtroom, said nothing, but he exchanged a glance with Murren and Ella across the aisle. Without speaking, they all understood what had just happened. The story had changed course. Later that evening, back at the hotel, Yarrick sat beside Caden on the edge of the bed, while Tyron played with a soft toy on the blanket. The airline had offered Yarrick counseling services, access to therapists, and even a travel voucher. Yarrick had quietly declined them all. "I don't want sessions," he said, adjusting the corner of Tyron's blanket. "I want change." Caden looked at him with a rare expression, both proud and protective. "They'll ask again," he said softly. Yarrick nodded. "Let them. I'll still say no." Across the room, Caden opened his laptop and finalized a draft of the joint letter. Murren had already approved the wording. Ella added his name without revision. The letter called for a 3-point reform plan in passenger safety protocol, mandatory mid-flight incident reporting, automatic witness video archiving when minors are involved, and a formal review process for crew response records. Before submitting it, Caden turned off the desk lamp and glanced back at the room. Yarrick was now lying beside the crib, holding one of Tyron's small socks between his fingers, deep in thought. "Sometimes," Caden said more to himself than anyone, "dignity doesn't stop fists, but it finishes the fight." The room had already begun to fill with quiet tension as Caden Rellin stepped through the heavy glass doors of the Skylor Airlines executive boardroom. No greetings, no pleasantries, just eyes, watchful calculating, some concerned, others unreadable. The incident on Flight 718 had reached the tipping point. What once could have been muffled beneath layers of bureaucratic silence had now forced the company's top brass to convene. It wasn't the punch that shocked them. It was how preventable it had been, and how thoroughly documented it now was. Caden moved to the center of the conference space without hesitation. Behind him, a large screen flickered on, displaying a title, Systemic Silence, the cost of ignoring the quiet warnings. To his left, Yarrick stood silently beside a display table holding a set of labeled evidence drives and printed passenger statements. Though a faint bruise still marked his cheek, the teen held himself upright with the same quiet strength that had stunned an entire cabin of witnesses. "Let's begin," Caden said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. His fingers tapped once on the console, and the screen split into 4 synchronized angles. His wrist recorder, Dr. Elevon's phone, a nearby passenger's cam, and a panoramic cabin feed. The footage played with chilling clarity. Bron Ketter's punch, the gasps, Jarrett's restraint, and Caden's methodical response. Silence held the room until Caden's voice resumed. "This isn't just about one violent moment. It's about a pattern your system allowed to fester." Another tap. A chart appeared. 3 prior complaints filed against Bron in the past 11 months. Each mark resolved, though no evidence suggested any true investigation had followed. Heads turned as the door opened and the Ram Maul entered, placing a binder on the table. "These," he said, "are sealed case summaries involving Mr. Ketter. We obtained them under judicial request due to public safety considerations." His eyes scanned the board members. 2 involved racial harassment. 1 involved an attempted staff dismissal through falsified claims. A murmur rippled through the room. One executive, older, gray-templed, shifted uncomfortably. "Why didn't this come to our attention sooner?" Caden didn't answer directly. Instead, he moved the second slide, projected legal exposure, Q3 and Q4. Below it, figures appeared. Settlement risks, passenger trust surveys, mid-flight incident report surges. The language was one the board understood. Numbers. "You didn't lose control when Bron threw that punch," Caden said. "You lost control the first time he was quietly escorted off a flight without consequence." Another voice entered the conversation. Rollin Vesk, the flight attendant from 718, had been seated toward the back, invited as a witness. He stood now, his voice steady but soft. "I did what I could in that moment. But even I knew, if he hadn't hit someone, it might have just gone in a drawer again." The board chair glanced over. "And yet you didn't panic. You kept order." "Only because Mr. Rellin held the line," Rollin replied. "The cabin followed him before they followed me." Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, an offer. "Mr. Vesk," one director said, "would you consider moving into a supervisory role? We need people with level heads at the training tier." Rollin blinked. "On one condition. Mandatory de-escalation training. Not optional. Not by request. Required." The chair nodded solemnly. "Granted." The moment pivoted again when the chair addressed Yarrick. "Young man, would you be willing to share anything?" Yarrick hesitated. Caden looked over and gave a slight nod. The teen stepped forward, voice low but steady. "I didn't need the cabin to fight for me," he said. "I just needed it not to stay silent." The words fell into the room like a stone into water, rippling, undeniable. One executive looked away. Another closed his laptop, shame flickering behind his eyes. Caden allowed the weight of silence to linger before offering his final proposal. 3 steps. Transparent complaint logging with timestamps, real-time in-flight misconduct tracking accessible to a central crew database, and a post-flight passenger defense review board. No theatrics, just structure, actionable, unignorable. As murmurs of agreement passed through the board, a reporter, granted limited access for accountability, raised his hand. "Mr. Rellin," he asked, "given your role, how should we list you in our coverage? Executive consultant? Aviation ethics advisor?" Caden turned to him, expression calm but clear. His answer required no hesitation. "Father first, CO after." 2 months after the incident on Skylure Flight 718, The airline's official channels released a quiet but groundbreaking announcement. A new policy titled the Yarrick Clause had been ratified. The policy mandated the auto-archiving of in-cabin witness recordings in any reported incident involving minors. It was the first time in the company's history that a regulation had been named after a passenger, especially a 15-year-old boy who had refused to strike back. The memo, brief but firm, circulated in both internal crew bulletins and public press releases. And though its tone was technical, its implications were personal. For those who knew the story, this was not just an update in procedure. It was an acknowledgement of injustice and a promise not to repeat it. Bron Ketter's name was absent from the memo, but his shadow lingered over every line. Since his arrest and failed countersuit, Bron had vanished from public view, his name quietly removed from affiliate directories, his image erased from corporate panels where he once stood with smug pride. Yet silence is never neutral. Whispers began to surface from inside the industry, whistleblowers who had worked with him, or worse, under him. One message, delivered anonymously to a third-party aviation watchdog, contained scanned documents, a sealed report from a sister airline, dated 18 months earlier. It described Bron berating a young staff member, pushing a tray cart into a passenger, and threatening termination against a gate agent for allowing children to sit in his visual line. The report had been buried, resolved internally, it claimed. But that file, unsealed now by court order, reopened more than just paperwork. It reopened Bron's past civil cases, each with a fresh look under the lens of Skylure's newest scandal. In the center of this quiet storm stood Dr. Caden Rowland, composed as ever. He was offered consulting roles by travel safety councils, transportation ethics boards, and even private corporations seeking to distance themselves from scandal. He declined each one. "I'm not building for headlines," Caden told a regional advisor during one call. "I'm building for families." Instead, he launched a nonprofit, one rooted in defense, not debate. Its mission was clear: support families who experience discrimination or misconduct during air travel and provide them with legal resources, media defense, and trauma support. The organization's first program was named Tyron, after the infant who'd been in that baby carrier during the punch. The acronym, Travel Integrity Response Outreach Network, wasn't chosen for sentiment. It was chosen for strategy. Every call it answered would carry the name of the child whose silence sparked change. Meanwhile, the press caught on. A well-known columnist from the National Tribune requested an exclusive interview with Caden. He refused. "This isn't my story to headline," he explained. But one article did appear, an editorial by Murren. The retired principal who'd spoken up mid-flight had submitted a piece to his local paper, and it had been picked up nationally. It was titled, "A Teen with Bruised Skin and Unshaken Character." In it, Murren detailed not just the events of the flight, but the silence that followed. Not the silence of cowards, but a father and son who refused to scream in chaos, because they were preparing for precision. The editorial struck a nerve. Schools requested permission to distribute it during assemblies. Airline employees quietly printed copies and slipped them into breakroom bulletin boards. It wasn't a viral article. It was a grounded one, and that made it harder to ignore. Amid all this, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, postmarked from the very terminal where Flight 718 had departed. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single page, carefully penned in blue ink. The handwriting was slightly shaky, but the words deliberate. "I was the gate agent on your flight. I didn't speak up when you boarded. I noticed the looks, the way Bron stared, the way others froze. But I kept my head down. I told myself it wasn't my place. I watched you walk by and said nothing. I watched your son settle the baby into his lap, and I said nothing. I thought silence was neutral, but I was wrong. I didn't speak up then. I will now." The applause had barely faded when the screen behind Caden flickered to life. A still frame filled the auditorium, a grainy but unmistakable image of Yarrick, mid-flight, leaning forward with quiet care as he adjusted Tyron's blanket, shielding the infant from the chaos around them. The room fell into silence again, not from obligation, but from the weight of what they saw. There was no violence in the frame, no shouting, no fists, Just a 15-year-old boy, bruised but composed, putting protection before pain. Caden stood at the podium, posture tall and eyes steady, waiting until the image settled deep into every attendee's memory. The conference hall at the National Ethics Summit in Aviation was packed, rows of chairs filled with airline executives, policymakers, crew union leaders, and passengers' rights advocates. Yet the only sound now was Tyron's gentle cooing from the front row, cradled in Jarek's arms. "This," Caden began, his voice deliberate and clear, "is the moment the world missed." He gestured toward the screen. Not the punch, not the accusations, not the courtroom drama. This. His hand returned to his side, fingers flexing once, as if releasing restraint. This moment, where a teenager did what our systems couldn't. He protected someone vulnerable without needing instruction, training, or approval. He just acted. Some in the audience shifted in their seats, uneasy. Caden noticed. He pressed on. "You've seen the reports, the policies, the aftermath. You know the procedures we rewrote, the consequences enforced, the clause that bears my son's name." He paused and turned slightly to glance at Jarek, who gave the smallest of nods. Tyron yawned, blissfully unaware he'd become a national symbol of systemic failure and quiet strength. "But let's not pretend," Caden continued, his tone tightening with purpose. "Let's not pretend that reform alone is what changed the narrative. Because long before the cameras came on, the system had already failed." He let the silence breathe for a moment, letting the weight of the words fall where they needed to. Then he walked away from the podium, slowly pacing the stage, no notes in hand, just memory and resolve. There's a temptation in crises like this to focus only on punishment, to pin the story on the fall of one man, one crew, one mistake. He stopped, eyes locking with a row of airline board members near the center aisle. But this isn't about one man. Braun didn't start this problem. He only exposed it. Gasps and quiet agreement rippled across the room. Caden's voice lowered, becoming intimate. He exposed how deeply we mistaken silence for professionalism, how we confuse comfort for justice, and how we've allowed arrogance to hide behind rank and policy. He returned to the center of the stage and tapped control. The image changed. It now showed the final frame from the sync cabin footage, a side angle where Braun stood handcuffed at the front of the plane, and Jarek, still seated, looked away, hand on Tyron's carrier. No glares, no speeches, just resolve. "This is the cost of delayed courage," Caden said softly. He lifted his gaze toward the back rows, where younger trainees and newly recruited crew members Saturday. "To those of you just entering this field, you are not merely serving drinks or reading safety cards. You are the guardians of dignity at 30,000 feet. A wave of emotion passed across the younger faces. A few glanced toward Jarek. Caden took a breath, his voice softening. "I did not come here as a CEO. I came here as a father. I did not come to build policies. I came to remind you what it feels like to be human. Because when a teen boy remains calmer than the system meant to protect him, the system is broken." Murmurs swept through the hall. Even the hard-faced compliance officers began to nod slowly. Then, stepping down from the podium's light, Caden turned to his son. Jarek met his gaze without blinking, his grip on Tyron unwavering. "The world didn't change because you fought back," Caden said to him, his voice carrying through the still auditorium. "It changed because you didn't flinch." Seconds later, the father acted, neutralizing the threat, protecting his teen, and leaving the passenger frozen in shock. The crew and passengers watched as accountability struck immediately. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with speed, discipline, and decisive force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, entitlement, and standing up to aggressive behavior in moments of injustice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and protection for the vulnerable.